Okay.
Is that there? Yeah? Okay, great. Look, thank you very much. And thanks particularly to Effie for really being one of the big inspirations for this event that we have today, and the amount of work and encouragement that Effie and others, Dimitra, have given to us. But really welcome to everyone here for coming and joining us in this symposium. What I just want to do today is really just kind of introduce very briefly, in about 5 minutes, what I think are some of the issues that we are facing. I mean, everyone here is very aware, and Effie has indeed just reiterated the point, that sexual violence is both under-researched, but also it is under-theorized. And now is the time for historians, anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists, etc., and people in a huge range of disciplines to actually critique those silences within our own disciplines, as well as, and I think this is equally important, to reach out to further and wider audiences within our different communities. This work of critique is, I think, extremely urgent. What we are seeing today in the mass media, as well as in many academic circles, where sexual violence is kind of being positioned as something that is natural to masculinity. Violent men, a kind of constant theme of society, a constant feature of society. Some even argue, some very well-respected academics are even arguing that rape is a biological imperative. It's important, therefore, I think, to emphasize that, as the wonderful critic Anne Cahill argues, there are many biological possibilities that are not political realities. Sexual violence, of course, is highly situated in historical time and geographical space, and is permeated through and through with humdrum practices and everyday knowledges. Now, of course, feminist practice, feminist history, is founded on habits of critique, both outward critique, critiquing the other, but also critique inwards. Only by engaging in this dual process can we not only imagine a world without sexual violence, but we can also start to take very practical steps towards creating those kinds of worlds. I think one of the first steps in eradicating sexual violence involves a reinterrogation of that masculine. There is no gender equivalence in sexual violence. Men act in sexually aggressive ways at a much higher level, extremely much higher level than women do. Yet, I think if we look at too much contemporary writing, including, again, academic writing, the male subject either appears in a kind of cartoonish simplicity, either as this kind of all-powerful guardian of the phallic imaginary, or they appear as these kind of pathetic creatures emasculated by their own pursuit of power. It's always important to recognize that sexual aggressors are not patriarchy's stormtroopers, but its inadequate spawn. Now, as opposed to the rather pessimistic assessments that Eros and Thanatos may be intertwined and have a masculine gender, either literally in the works of people like Susan Brown-Miller, or more philosophically in a certain kind of Lacanian and psychoanalytical analyses. Despite this, the male sex organ is a deeply flawed instrument of power, with none of the resilience of, for example, the fist. As I argue in my book, Rape, sexually aggressive men in modern Western societies actually weaken male power regimes. They corrode the category man and its imaginary phallic edifice. In history, compulsory heterosexuality, marriage vows, the gendered division of labor have been, in fact, particularly effective ways of controlling women. Women's, of course, not to deny, women's fear of rape has enabled men to assume the mantle of beneficial, benevolent protectors, while, of course, further confining their womenfolk to domestic and other purportedly safe spheres. But fear is a particularly blunt instrument of domination. The actions of men on the streets, intimidating, harassing, assaulting women, jeopardize, in fact, the bastion of male, mature masculinity, subverting and threatening male governance, in part because they incite female resistance by exposing the brutal force behind patriarchy's caress. I believe, in other words, that we must remain committed to a feminism that celebrates sexual pleasure, while, of course, remaining committed to the fundamental struggle of critique, power always contested. We need, I think, to seek out new practices, new languages for rebelliousness if we are to forge this world without sexual violence. And this, I think, is what our project Shame seeks to do, or attempts to do, at least to move some few steps towards that grand aim. Shame, of course, stands for Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. And I think more the team is here. I just want to introduce you to them because not all will be speaking today. So please, seek out those people who have interests closer to your own. We have Adeline over there, who's our anthropologist and theorist, who works on feminist sex assault centers in Paris. We have Caitlin, who is there, who'll be chairing these sessions, who works on sexual violence on the American frontier. We have Emma. There's Emma there, who has actually just started with us, who works on the use of psychiatric evidence in courts today. We have Louise, cultures of harm in institutions of care. We have Ria, who works on anorexia, but also is our public engagement officer. And I must pause here and say we owe Ria huge thanks because she has done the heavy lifting from our side. So thank you very much, Ria. We have Ruth, who will be speaking later, who works on public health and child sexual abuse. And then we have Stephanie, who is there, who works on sexual violence in Franco, Spain. So please introduce yourself to these people during the breaks. So this is a 5-year, very interdisciplinary, as you will have seen, interdisciplinary projects. And we explore a number of issues. I think the main ones are, well, what actually happens when a victim of sexual violence seeks help? What happens when that takes place? How have family doctors, police doctors, health visitors, nurses dealt with victims? How can we explain cultures of harm in institutions of care? And here, thinking particularly of the abuse of elderly men and women in care homes. How are victims treated in law courts? How have the ways that we all, as academics, as activists, as thinkers, how have the ways that we make sense of perpetrators of sexual violence changed over time? And what does that tell us, actually, about our own societies? Is something different happening when we look at children, at child sexual abuse? And, of course, what are the psychiatric aftermaths of sexual violence? We argue that the changing functions of medical professionals in understanding, interpreting, and adjudicating on instances of sexual violence have been insufficiently contextualized. A better understanding of the medical responses to sexual violence is, I think, imperative given its health outcomes. In other words, physical harms, injury, sexually transmitted infection, unwanted pregnancy. Its psychological harms, anxiety, depression, PTSD, and life outcomes, sexual, social dysfunction, drug and alcohol abuse, self-harm, suicide. Sexual violence, of course, also generates major health outcomes for the victims' families, friends, and indeed entire communities. So, in other words, a sustained out analysis, we argue, of the history of medical engagements with sexual violence addresses current debates that are happening throughout the world about the treatment of rape victims and the needs of justice. And so, after those introductory remarks, let us get the discussion started. Caitlin and the first session. Thank you very much.